Entropy breaks down here, Grayson muttered, drawing a line he knew was wrong, but he didn't know why. Hawthorne Institute of Physics, Massachusetts. 2:00 a.m. Rain tapped gently on the tall windows, slow, old, like the breathing of something tired. Professor Ian Grayson sat alone in his fourth-floor lab beneath the soft gold of a reading lamp. The blackboards around him were filled with ghost-white equations, dense, beautiful, hopeless. Just hours ago, he had presented his findings to the elite physicists of the eastern seaboard. Now there was no applause, only silence and exhaustion. He was chasing a question that had haunted him for 13 years. What happens to entropy near a black hole's singularity? According to Bekenstein-Hawking theory, entropy is proportional to the surface area of the event horizon. But beyond that, as space-time collapses inward, every known model fails. The math breaks. Information disappears. And that, to Ian Grayson, was unacceptable. He whispered again, more to himself than the room. Entropy breaks down here. At the singularity, it vanishes. His hand moved slowly, trembling slightly, and he drew the last term in the entropy equation. It was wrong. He knew it. But he had nothing else. He stepped back, looked at the board, at the years of work, the promises he had once made to the scientific world, to himself, to someone he no longer spoke of. Then, quietly, he turned off the light. The door clicked shut behind him. A few seconds later, it opened again. A boy stood in the hallway, silent, motionless. He didn't flinch when the door creaked. He didn't move when the light disappeared. He only stared at the board, as if it were a star map in the night sky. His name was Emmett, 9 years old, son of Jerry, the janitor who worked the overnight shift. Emmett didn't speak. Doctors had called it severe autism. Jerry called it something else. He said Emmett spoke, just not in ways the world had learned to listen to. Emmett loved light and curves. That night, as Jerry was scrubbing floor tiles 2 levels below, Emmett wandered quietly into the lab, drawn by something only he could sense. The room was still. The chalk dust hung in the air like memory. The blackboard shimmered faintly in the afterglow of equations. Emmett walked toward it. He didn't touch. He only looked, and he didn't blink. There, on the left corner of the board, was the unfinished line Professor Grayson had drawn, the broken trail of a mind that had run out of answers. Emmett stood there, head tilted, as if reading something written not in chalk, but behind it, like words in another dimension, coming slowly into focus. At 1:58 a.m., he moved. He turned, saw a small piece of chalk lying near the baseboard, picked it up carefully with both hands, and began to draw. It wasn't a formula, not an equation. It was a spiral. A strange, soft, deliberate spiral. Not random, not childish, but something else, something older. He moved slowly, but with certainty, like a calligrapher. Each curve precise, each arc intentional. No tremble, no correction. As if his hands remembered something his voice could not say. At 2:00 a.m. exactly, he stepped back. He stared at the spiral, not to admire it, to listen. Because in Emmett's world, curves had sound, and this one, this spiral, was whispering something only he could hear. The next morning, Professor Grayson walked in holding cold coffee and a colder heart. He looked at the board and stopped breathing. There, beneath the equation he had abandoned, was the spiral, chalk white, clean, gentle. He stepped closer. It looked like something he had only glimpsed once before, in the deep theories of Mobius strips and non-orientable spaces. It was wrong, but it was beautiful. And maybe it wasn't wrong at all. He whispered, almost afraid, "What is this?" His fingers brushed the chalk. It flaked, fresh. Someone had been here last night. He turned to the security monitor, fast-forwarded the footage, then froze. A boy, small, hooded, alone. Grayson watched, mouth dry, as the child reached for the chalk and began to draw. Not doodle, not guess. Draw. He replayed the footage again, this time slower, measured each stroke, felt something ancient stir in his bones. "This isn't random," he said. "This is intentional geometry. A kind of symmetry not taught in books. A space that seemed to fold in on itself, but didn't vanish. Entropy," he thought. Maybe entropy doesn't vanish here. The thought hit like lightning, then disappeared. Grayson stood in silence for a long time. When Jerry entered the lab with his mop and keys, he found the professor still frozen before the board. Grayson turned, voice hoarse. "Who drew this?" Jerry hesitated, embarrassed. "Might have been my boy, Emmett. He doesn't talk, but sometimes he likes sitting near the light. He likes watching the chalk marks. I don't know why." Grayson didn't respond. He looked at Jerry not with pity, not with disbelief, but with something else entirely, as if the janitor had walked in carrying a message from the stars, as if the boy, the silent, strange boy, had written something that might change the nature of physics itself, and nobody, not even the greatest minds in the world, knew how to read it, except him. They called him the mute kid. But Emmett had always spoken, just in ways no one knew how to hear. At night, the Hawthorne Institute went quiet. Not the kind of quiet you find in libraries or lecture halls. This was deeper, older. A silence that filled the walls after the minds had left. A hush that settled into the floors after the weight of genius had passed. And in that silence walked Jerry. He wasn't a physicist. He didn't have a PhD or any letters after his name. His only tools were a mop, a ring of keys, and a beat-up radio he kept clipped to his belt. But Jerry had something none of the professors had. A son who listened to light. His name was Emmett, 9 years old, small, thin, and always watching. He didn't talk. Doctors had diagnosed him with severe nonverbal autism. Schools couldn't teach him. Therapists couldn't reach him. Even Jerry, who had raised him alone after his wife passed away, didn't always understand what was happening inside his boy. But he knew this. Every time Emmett looked at light, through glass, across water, or in the flicker of a street lamp, he smiled. Not with his mouth, but with something quieter, something deeper. Jerry couldn't afford a sitter, not on the wages the Institute paid him. So he brought Emmett along on the night shifts. He made a little bed for him in the janitor's closet with an old blanket and some books. But Emmett rarely stayed there. Instead, he wandered the halls like a silent observer, trailing his fingers along cold stone, pausing at the glow of exit signs, staring up at spiraling ceiling lights as if mapping a galaxy. Most people ignored him. Some pitied him. A few students laughed behind his back, but Emmett didn't seem to notice. And Jerry? Jerry prayed each night that his son would be safe in this building full of minds that didn't know how to see him. The night before, when Emmett had entered Professor Grayson's lab and drawn the spiral, Jerry had been 2 floors below, scrubbing chalk dust from the stairwells. He didn't know what Emmett was doing. He only knew the boy had wandered off again. He had checked the cameras once or twice, and when he saw Emmett just sitting in the hallway or staring at the lab doors, he let him be. "He ain't hurting nobody," Jerry would say. "Let the boy be curious." It wasn't until the next morning, when Grayson approached him, eyes hollow, voice hushed, that Jerry realized something had happened. "You said your boy was here last night?" Jerry nodded, unsure. Grayson looked past him, then back. "What is he like? What does he understand?" Jerry scratched his neck. "I don't rightly know, sir. He don't talk, but he stares at light. Lines, shapes, patterns. He draws sometimes, in the dust or the fog on glass. Circles, swirls." Grayson didn't respond. He just looked at the floor, as if seeing it for the first time. That night, something changed. Grayson didn't go home. He stayed, waited. When Jerry arrived for his shift, Grayson was already in the lab, setting up simulations on the projector. He barely acknowledged Jerry, but kept glancing at the door. It was almost midnight when Emmett walked in. He didn't look at the professor, didn't greet his father. He simply stood there, head tilted, watching the slow orbit of digital particles on the screen. Grayson turned. He hesitated. Then quietly, he spoke. Not to command, not to teach, but to wonder. "You see this?" he said. "This is a gravity well. It's what happens near a black hole. Space bends, time slows, and entropy—" He let the word hang. Emmett stepped closer. Grayson tapped a key. The simulation changed, showing a spiral of particles falling inward, compressing into singularity. "Here," he said, "everything breaks. The math doesn't hold. We lose information. We lose meaning." And then, Emmett did something he had never done before. He reached forward. One small finger extended and pressed a key. The model shifted. Grayson blinked. He stepped back, unsure if what he saw was a glitch or a revelation. The simulation no longer collapsed. Instead, the spiral tightened, curved, and reversed. Information looped back through the model. Entropy did not vanish. It folded. The room was still. Grayson ran the simulation again. Same result. He looked at Emmett. The boy didn't smile, didn't move. He simply watched. "Who taught you that?" Grayson asked, breathless. Emmett said nothing. Jerry, who had been watching from the hall, stepped in, whispering, "He didn't learn it, sir. He just sees it." Grayson sat down slowly. And that night, for the first time in years, he felt awe. Over the next few nights, Grayson became a man obsessed. He invited Jerry and Emmett to the lab each evening. Jerry, skeptical at first, began to understand that something extraordinary was happening. He watched as his son interacted with projections, fractals, even tensor equations, never speaking, never explaining, but always seeing what others missed. Grayson started keeping a notebook. He sketched the spiral again and again, overlaying it onto entropy functions, mapping it across singularity models, testing its properties against known physics. He didn't understand it. Not fully. But he believed it. He began calling it the Emmett curve. L. "It's not mathematics," he murmured to himself. "It's a geometry of seeing." One evening, a young research assistant named Layla came into the lab. She had heard rumors. She was skeptical. "You're telling me this kid pointed at a simulation and fixed entropy?" Grayson didn't respond. He simply pulled up the footage. the security recording from that night. She watched it, silent. Then she asked to see the spiral. He showed her. Her eyes widened. "This is non-orientable topology," she whispered. "Like a Mobius surface, but recursive and dynamic." Grayson nodded. He drew it without training, without context, just from looking. Layla stepped back. "Professor, do you realize what this could mean for black hole thermodynamics?" Grayson didn't answer, because deep down, he knew. But saying it aloud would make it real. And he wasn't ready. Not yet. That night, after Jerry and Emmett had gone home, Grayson stayed in the lab. He didn't run models, didn't touch the chalk. He just sat. Sat with the knowledge that a boy no one believed in had just reopened a question physics had long since buried. Entropy. The end of order. But maybe not. Maybe if you saw the spiral, not as collapse, but as return. Entropy wasn't the end at all. Just the beginning of a different kind of symmetry. At 1:58 a.m., he reached for a stick of chalk. At 2 o'clock, he bent space with one curve. Autumn had just begun, and by 2 a.m., the towers of the Hawthorne Institute wore the color of ash. The lights inside had long since gone dark, save for the pale green glow of a simulation room still running overnight projections. There is a kind of sacred quiet in research institutes at night. No heels clicking, no laughter echoing down halls, just the slow, purposeful footsteps of a janitor, and the shadow of a small boy trailing quietly behind. Emmett didn't speak. He didn't react when Grayson began projecting black hole models onto the lab wall. But Grayson noticed something. The boy was watching. Not watching the simulation. Watching the curves. At 1:58 a.m., Emmett moved silently toward the chalkboard. On it, the entropy equation still sat incomplete, alongside numerical fields from Grayson's previous simulations. He stopped 3 paces away, studied it, like someone checking how light bends across a lens. Then he turned to the corner of the room where Jerry usually kept the erasers and broken chalk. There, half buried in dust, was a short piece of white chalk. He picked it up with both hands. He stood still for a moment. Then, slowly, he raised the chalk to the board. Professor Grayson said nothing. He simply watched. This time, Emmett did not draw the same spiral as before. It was a variation, a deformation, but with an underlying symmetry. He wasn't drawing the figure itself. He was drawing its boundary. In mathematics, that's called a manifold boundary, the outer edge of a curved space. But what Emmett did redefined symmetry. He didn't follow the known structures. He folded them. Grayson squinted. Was it a Mobius variant? A projected manifold? Or something entirely new? At exactly 2 o'clock a.m., the overhead light caught the chalk just as Grayson's simulation displayed a new iteration of entropy collapse. The projected spiral landed directly onto Emmett's chalk spiral. Perfect alignment. Grayson froze. The projection, meant to simulate entropy decaying into a singularity, no longer collapsed into noise. Instead, it folded cleanly inward, turned, and formed a closed loop. Like entropy had found a way back. "It doesn't collapse," Grayson whispered. "Entropy doesn't disappear. It reflects." He replayed the simulation. Again, the entropy curve responded to the chalk spiral. Data that once dropped into nothingness now circled and returned. The simulation read this as a possible information recovery path. Grayson reached for his notes but stopped. He knew this wasn't his to explain yet. not without understanding the spiral. He looked at Emmett, who had already walked away. The boy didn't wait for praise. He just drew the truth and left it behind. In the week that followed, Grayson became obsessed. He stopped attending faculty lunches, canceled guest lectures. He rarely spoke unless it was to Jerry or Emmett. He printed simulation after simulation. He took Emmett's spiral and overlaid it onto data from gravitational wells, entropy decay charts, and theoretical singularity wells. He noticed a pattern. Entropy, when nearing critical density, didn't dive to zero. Instead, it approached a curve, a stable geometry, a mirror basin. It was a theoretical space in which information doesn't die. It redirects. He began calling it reflective entropy geometry. The phrase spread quietly through the late-night corridors, first whispered, then discussed. Most thought it was a metaphor. They didn't yet know a child had drawn it. Each night, Emmett returned, never at the same time. Sometimes he just sat. Sometimes he picked up chalk. Sometimes he touched the edge of a screen and changed a variable. And each time, something remarkable happened. The models held longer. The equations stabilized. The graphs no longer collapsed past the singularity. Entropy inverted, not destroyed, not reversed, just curved. And always, there was the spiral, not identical, each one slightly different. As if Emmett wasn't copying a shape, but listening to a language only he could hear. Grayson documented everything, but deep down he was starting to realize this wasn't about physics anymore. This was about perception, about how Emmett saw the world. One night, Grayson brought in a visiting cosmologist from Cambridge, Dr. Evan LaRoche. He had no idea what to expect. He only said, "Watch the simulation and the chalkboard." Emmett entered the room quietly, carrying a small flashlight he liked to click on and off. Dr. LaRoche watched, skeptical. Then the boy approached the board and drew another spiral. Not with flourish, with care. LaRoche blinked. "That's a recursive Mobius loop." Grayson nodded, but self-reflecting. It contains both direction and inversion. The simulation on screen reacted. Again, entropy stabilized. Again, information folded. LaRoche sat down. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Who taught him this?" Grayson only said, "Nobody. He listens." Later that night, Jerry watched the video from outside the lab. He watched his son move silently, draw gently. Jerry didn't understand manifolds or topologies, but he saw something he recognized. The calm, the quiet certainty, the look of a boy not trying to prove anything, just showing what he knew, like drawing a map for someone lost. By the end of the month, Grayson had over 40 pages of notes on the spiral forms, each one distinct, each one aligned to a moment when entropy, in theory, should have collapsed. And each time, it didn't. It circled, curved, echoed back. In a notebook labeled E-Curves, Grayson wrote, "What if entropy is not a fall, but a fold? What if the universe doesn't decay, but reflects? What if at the heart of singularity there isn't nothing but a mirror?" But none of that made it into the papers. None of it was published. Not yet. Grayson wasn't ready, because to publish it would mean explaining Emmett. And Grayson wasn't sure the world was ready to listen. Not to a boy who didn't speak. Not to a spiral drawn in dust. Not to the idea that truth could come from silence. So instead, Grayson waited and watched. Each night, Emmett came back and drew. Sometimes on the board, sometimes in the condensation of a glass window, sometimes in dust, and each time the curve bent space and said quietly, "Everything is still here. You're just looking the wrong way." "No one on this campus knows this topology," Grayson whispered. "This isn't math, it's geometry folding into itself." It began with a photocopy. Grayson had taken Emmett's spiral, one of the earlier versions drawn on the board, and scanned it onto his old HP printer. He didn't know why. Maybe to archive it. Maybe to study the curve without chalk dust. Maybe, just maybe, to hold something sacred on paper. He left a copy in the conference room. It was supposed to be harmless, but the next morning when Grayson returned, the paper was gone. In its place was a note. "Who drew this?" No name, just the question. By the end of the week, the spiral had been reprinted half a dozen times, not by Grayson, but by someone else. Pinned to walls, slipped under office doors, folded into the margins of lecture notes. It moved like a ghost. Some thought it was art. Others, the ones who knew topology, recognized something more troubling, because the curve wasn't decorative. It obeyed rules, strange rules. One geometry professor found that when overlaid on a non-orientable surface model, the spiral mapped to a closed recursive loop, something not yet published. Another physicist traced the curve into simulation software and watched as entropy levels stabilized, just like Grayson's had. But when they asked Grayson where it came from, he only said, "I'm still studying it." Privately, he knew he couldn't hide Emmett's drawings much longer. The spiral was spreading, not just through minds, but through equations. One doctoral student named Celine tried plotting it in polar coordinates. She failed. The curve didn't conform. It had folds, doublings, self-intersections that behaved as if they were intentional, yet non-deterministic. "It's not a function," she told Grayson. He nodded. "It's a voice," he said. That weekend, Grayson cleared the lecture hall at midnight. Just him, Emmett, and a high-resolution projector. He uploaded several models: entropy curves, black hole density maps, time dilation paths. Then he handed Emmett the chalk. The boy did not hesitate. He drew, not just one spiral, a series of them. Each one responding to the model on the wall, each one warping the projected space, each one bending geometry in ways no one had expected. Grayson filmed the whole thing. For the first time, Emmett's spirals were no longer just symbols. They were responses. They were language. Grayson spent the next day analyzing frame by frame what Emmett had drawn. It wasn't random. It wasn't decorative. Each spiral correlated with known points of instability in the simulations. Each line responded precisely to shifts in entropy gradient. And yet, the spiral was doing something equations could not. It adapted. Where math collapsed, the curve twisted. Where information blurred, the spiral folded. It was alive. A few faculty members began to notice Grayson's absence from department meetings. Whispers circled about a project, some late-night experiment involving chalk, spirals, and a janitor's kid. One administrator joked, "What's next? Crop circles in the physics lab?" But when Professor Malik, an expert in differential geometry, saw a print of the spiral, he stopped laughing. He traced it, over and over. "This is impossible," he muttered. "It's not math we know. It's not math we've invented yet." That night, Grayson finally brought someone into the fold. A graduate researcher named Layla, the same one who had first recognized a Mobius-like form in Emmett's drawing. He showed her the newest footage. She watched in silence, and then said, "He's not drawing from theory. He's drawing from space itself." Grayson nodded. "He sees the fold before we calculate it." Layla looked at the board. And this curve, it's not even closed. It loops, but it leaves space for something else, like it's listening. For the first time in years, Grayson felt like a student again. Not of math, not of physics, but of something older, something deeper than formula. He began waking early, staying late. He didn't just study the spiral, he listened to it. By mid-November, the spiral had appeared in 5 unpublished drafts across departments. Someone had traced it into a paper on thermodynamic thresholds. Another embedded it in a presentation on quantum information. But no one could explain it. Not yet. It wasn't a function. It wasn't a number. It was a symbol. And it shouldn't exist. He's just the janitor's kid, someone said. But that night, Grayson couldn't sleep. Names have weight in places like Hawthorne. They come attached to theses, to awards, to legacies carved in stone outside lecture halls. Every door in the physics department bore a plaque, PhD, FRS, Nobel laureate. People weren't just people, they were citations. But Emmett had no name on any door, not in any registry, not in any file, not even a last name that anyone remembered. "He's just the janitor's kid," someone whispered in the faculty lounge after a copy of the spiral turned up taped to the back of the espresso machine. Grayson didn't respond. He walked out of the lounge, into the hallway, down into the maintenance wing. He found Jerry scrubbing the baseboards of the West lab. The old man looked up, wary. "You need something, sir?" Grayson hesitated, then shook his head. "No, just wanted to ask about your son." Jerry sat back on his heels. "He do something wrong?" "No," Grayson said quickly. "No, quite the opposite." He paused. "He's gifted, beyond anything I've seen." Jerry didn't laugh, didn't smile, just said, "I always thought he saw something I didn't." Grayson sat with him on the floor. They didn't speak for a while. Then Jerry told him things he hadn't shared with anyone. About the day Emmett stopped speaking, after his mother died. About the drawings in condensation, in the dirt, in the steam of the shower door. About the way the boy would stare at ceiling fans, or moonlight through blinds, or the twisting branches of trees. "Always something spinning," Jerry said. "Always something turning. I used to think it was just a phase." Grayson shook his head. "It's not a phase. It's a pattern." That night, Grayson couldn't sleep. He sat in his office replaying footage of Emmett drawing, over and over, zooming in, slowing frames. He charted the spiral's arc angles, the inflection points, the radial transitions. Each time they matched some previously unstable entropy model, but there was something else, something not in the math. It was the way Emmett held the chalk, like a violinist holds a bow, delicate, intentional, as if he wasn't solving something, as if he was playing it. The next morning, Grayson went to the registrar's office. He asked for records on Emmett. The assistant blinked. Emmett who? He didn't know. They searched Jerry's file, found a partial form, a box marked dependent, male child age 9. No name attached, no ID number, just a note. Medical exception filed, nonverbal. Technically, Emmett didn't exist in the system. He was invisible. That afternoon, Grayson asked Emmett if he wanted to draw again. The boy didn't answer, but when the simulation began, he stood up. He picked up the chalk and drew. This time, not on the board, on the window. Condensation blurred the glass, and Emmett used a single finger to trace a spiral against the night sky. Outside, the full moon glowed behind trees. Grayson stood beside him, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a teacher. He felt like a witness. The next day, Grayson submitted a proposal. Independent Research Grant Proposal, Geometric Entropy. Stabilization in Recursive Manifolds. He included simulations and photos, but not the boy. He left Emmett's name out, because there was no name, and because he knew what the committee would say. He waited a week, then 2. Finally, the review board replied, "Fascinating, innovative, but lacking in formal citation. Data source unclear. Resubmit with authorship clarification." They wanted a name. But Emmett wasn't a name. He was a silence, a curve, a proof drawn in breath. And Grayson knew. If he wanted this theory to live, he'd have to name the one who created it, even if the world wasn't ready, even if nobody knew his name. The equation shifted. It shouldn't have. But it did, the moment Emmett pointed. It began with a key press. A small, ordinary keyboard, dusty, half the letters worn off. Grayson was showing a simulation to the research team, a rotating gravity well near a Kerr black hole. It was standard stuff, relativistic time dilation, frame dragging, the collapse into singularity. Emmett sat off to the side, not watching the screen, watching the space around it. The glow, the curve of projected light. Grayson didn't see him move. No one did. But the next thing anyone knew, Emmett had leaned forward, reached out, and tapped a key. The model froze. Then shifted. A new vector appeared. A line that didn't belong. Grayson blinked. The curvature field changed. Instead of collapsing inward infinitely, the field bent, stabilized. It looked survivable. "That shouldn't be there," said Dr. Chen, who had been coding the simulation for weeks. But it was, and it held. They reran the simulation, again and again. Every time Emmett touched the model, once by adjusting a slider, once by tapping a toggle no one had noticed, the curve changed. Not wildly, elegantly, as if guided by a deeper symmetry. "It's not randomness," Grayson said. "He's selecting conditions we hadn't considered." Dr. Chen frowned. "But why do they work?" No one had an answer. That night, Grayson stayed late with Layla. They reviewed every simulation log, mapped Emmett's inputs, traced how each small change, angle shifts, density thresholds, microsecond timing, altered the outcome, and always, the entropy stabilized. "I don't think he's solving the equation," Layla said. Grayson looked up. "I think he's changing the equation." In physics, the gravity well is a metaphor, a bowl into which mass falls. The more mass, the deeper the bowl. At its center, singularity, the point of no return. But what Emmett did to that model was more than bend the bowl. He lifted it, introduced a counter-curvature, like the space itself wanted to remember something, or someone. Grayson began thinking in new terms. Not just mass and velocity, but memory. He wondered, could the universe store echoes? Could a black hole's collapse leave behind not silence but imprint? Could that be what the spiral meant? Not collapse, conservation. The next morning, Grayson brought Emmett to the auditorium, projected the full simulation. The same model that had collapsed weeks ago now spun in balance. The singularity diffused. The entropy curve stabilized along a path no textbook had ever shown. He turned to Emmett. "Can you show them?" The boy stepped forward. Not to the board. To the space beside it. He didn't write. He pointed. Not at an equation, at a gap. Layla saw it first. "There's no variable there," she said. "No term, just empty space. But when Emmett pointed, the projection shifted, and a new curve appeared. The system filled in the blank, self-generated a line of calculation that bent the energy field. Later, the logs showed Emmett had triggered an adaptive auto-solve, a feature meant only for developers. But the algorithm hadn't solved randomly. It had followed the spiral's logic. Grayson turned to the group. "He's not using our math," he said. "He's showing us how to rebuild it." The room fell quiet. No one argued. No one laughed. Because for the first time, the gravity well hadn't collapsed. It had curved and held. "You're telling us a mute boy introduced a new physics language?" the board member scoffed. The room was polished, wood-paneled, quiet. 12 faculty members, 4 administrators, 1 dean, and Professor Ian Grayson. Standing in front of them, hands trembling slightly as he loaded the presentation. Behind him, the projection screen flickered to life. Simulations, spiral overlays, time-stamped entropy curves. On paper, it was revolutionary. In the room, it was awkward. Because Grayson had submitted a theory, reflective entropy geometry, that cited no formal collaborator. And now he was trying to explain why. He walked them through the simulations, showed them the spiral, demonstrated how entropy stabilized at high-density points, how a collapse curve could fold instead of flatten, how the spiral responded to gravitational geometry. "It's not a traditional function," Grayson said. "It behaves like a geometric attractor, a stabilizing topology." Dr. Resnick raised an eyebrow. "And the origin of this spiral?" Grayson hesitated. "It was drawn by hand." Silence. "By whom?" Grayson met their eyes. "A child." Chairs creaked, mouths tightened. Someone whispered. Then the dean spoke. "A student?" Grayson shook his head. "No, he's the son of our night janitor." A few people looked away. Dr. Malik folded his arms. "And you believe this child contributed meaningfully to a new model of entropy?" "I do," Grayson said. The silence was thicker this time. Then someone scoffed. Professor Leland. "You're telling us a mute boy introduced a new physics language?" Grayson didn't answer. Instead, he played the video, footage from the lecture hall. Emmett drawing spiral after spiral in response to changing simulations, the real-time curve stabilizations, the entropy thresholds reversing, and then the final moment, when Emmett pointed and the model adapted. When the video ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Then, surprisingly, it was Dr. Resnick who leaned forward. "This model," she said slowly, "it resembles recursive topological folding. I've seen similar forms when studying loop quantum gravity, but only in unstable states." Grayson nodded. "But this isn't unstable. It's predictive." "And the boy? He understands this?" Grayson paused. "I don't think he explains it the way we do. But yes, he understands it." The dean cleared his throat. "We cannot accept research that names an unqualified, unregistered participant, especially a minor. Especially—" He didn't finish the sentence. Grayson spoke calmly. "Then don't name him, but don't erase him either." Outside the room, Emmett sat with Jerry in the hallway. He played with a plastic gear in his hand, clicking it, turning it, watching the pattern. Jerry didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew what it meant for your work to go unseen. He'd lived it all his life. Back in the room, the debate continued. Ethics, attribution, peer review. Grayson stood through it all, silent, until someone asked, "How do we even categorize this symbol? It's not math." No, Grayson said. It's not math. It's how math dreams. The curve was not just a symbol. It was a function. It was Layla who first turned the spiral into numbers. She didn't mean to. She'd been trying to rest, clearing her mind with a pencil and graph paper. But as she traced Emmett's spiral again, this time more slowly, she began mapping its progression like she would any recursive structure. And something clicked. Each rotation wasn't arbitrary. Each loop grew by a definable ratio. She grabbed a ruler, then code, fed the coordinates into a geometry engine. And the result stunned her. It wasn't a drawing, it was a function, a parametric equation. By morning, she had a prototype. F equals A E B C K us K A G thus E A E B sign, where A, B, and K adjusted according to the entropy pressure. It matched Emmett's curves almost exactly, not just visually, behaviorally. The spiral wasn't ornamental. It responded dynamically to energy distributions in the black hole simulations. It was alive with rules. When she showed Grayson, he stood silent, then whispered, "We've been looking at art, but it's music." That week, they published an internal white paper, Topological Recursion as Entropy Stabilization Mechanism. It was dense, precise, and anonymous. No mention of Emmett, but inside, the team knew. The spiral now had a name, the Emmett curve. The term spread faster than Grayson expected. Not in journals, not yet, but in labs. Graduate students whispered it during midnight problem sets. One postdoc chalked it outside the math building as a dare. Another used it to debug a chaotic oscillator simulation. And in every case, it worked. Where entropy failed, the Emmett curve held. In time, the Institute took notice. A committee was formed, not to validate the theory, to find its origin. Because breakthroughs, real breakthroughs, don't happen without names. And someone was missing from this one. A quiet researcher named Dr. Saeed ran a comparison. He took the original spiral Emmett had drawn, archived on security footage, and traced its coordinates against the published parametrics. The match was near perfect. He didn't say anything publicly, but in his office he wrote one line on the wall. The one who draws knows more than the one who calculates. Meanwhile, Jerry kept bringing Emmett to the lab, even after hours, even when no one asked. The boy kept drawing, sometimes on napkins, sometimes on the margins of Grayson's notes, once on the back of a physics journal. Every time the curve evolved, folded back into itself, as if answering a question only it had heard. One night, Emmett drew a variation that startled even Layla. The spiral split, one curve forward, one curve back. When she plotted the data, she realized it wasn't a spiral anymore. It was a map, a bifurcating path in space-time geometry. "It's a choice," she whispered. "Two timelines, two outcomes." Grayson stared at the board. "And it folds back," he said. "Even choice isn't lost." By now, the model was more than a curiosity. It was a candidate for a new entropy paradigm. Grayson gave a closed-door lecture. Most nodded politely. A few asked questions. Only one, Dr. Malik, raised a hand and said, "Where did the original curve come from?" Grayson paused, then said the name, out loud. "Emmett." The room was silent. The papers removed the name Emmett. Grayson refused to sign. It was supposed to be a milestone. The first official paper on reflective entropy geometry. Peer-reviewed. Data validated. ready for publication in the Journal of Theoretical Physics. Grayson had spent weeks refining the figures. Layla had proofed every graph. They submitted the draft. And then came the edits. The core remained untouched. The Emmett curve. The function now defined across multiple black hole models. The proof that entropy could fold, not vanish, at critical mass. But there was a new line in the byline. Derived from observational data provided by anonymous non-academic contributor. Grayson stared at it, then flipped to the acknowledgement section. It was gone. No mention of the boy. No Emmett. Not even a pronoun. He emailed the editorial board. They replied, "We cannot attribute authorship to a minor who lacks academic credentials and cannot verify intent." Grayson replied, "He doesn't need credentials. He changed the equation." They wrote back, "If you wish to proceed with publication, the contributor must remain unnamed." Grayson didn't respond. He printed the draft and crossed out the title. With a red pen, he wrote, "The theory is sound. The ethics are not." Layla was furious. Would they say the same if the contributor were a prodigy from MIT? Or a faculty member's child, Grayson added. They sat in silence, until Layla said, "Then we show them, all of it." Grayson looked up. "You mean?" She nodded. "The footage, the raw simulations, the spiral, the kid, everything." They uploaded the video, not to an academic portal, to the public. A quiet YouTube account. No commentary, just a title. "Entropy doesn't collapse. Watch the spiral." The clip spread fast. Physicists shared it, then mathematicians, then artists. People didn't understand the equations, but they understood the boy. A child, silent, drawing on a board, and the math responding. The curve folding, the singularity bow, curving back. Comments poured in. "I don't know physics, but I feel this. That child sees something we've forgotten. Is he real? Why isn't his name on the paper?" Journalists began asking questions, not about the math, about the boy. Who was he? Where did the spiral come from? Why wasn't he credited? Why had academia, again, silenced a voice it didn't understand? The institute panicked. A meeting was called. Grayson was summoned. They told him to take the video down. He refused. They told him to issue a statement. He wrote 2 words, his name. The next morning, someone chalked the spiral onto the front steps of the institute, in big white curves. At the bottom, a single word, Emmett Grayson, stood before it, then knelt and traced the curve with one hand. A security guard asked, "Did the kid draw this?" Grayson didn't look up. He only said, "No, we did." The final slide had no words, just a spiral, glowing faintly on the projector. The auditorium was full, not with press, not with physicists, with people. Old janitors in their best shirts. A woman who taught geometry at the middle school. Grayson's former students, some now professors, some not. A boy with a spiral drawn in marker on his backpack. And near the front row, Jerry, sitting beside his son. Emmett held a piece of chalk in his hand. It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't even a presentation. It was something older, a gathering, a returning. Grayson stood quietly at the front. No laser pointer, no podium, just the screen behind him. He clicked once. The projector lit up. And there it was, the spiral, white on black, slowly rotating. He said, I've spent my life trying to prove what happens at the edge of things, the boundary of a black hole, the last breath of information before collapse. He turned to Emmett. And this boy reminded me that edges are not ends. He looked at the crowd. An edge is a fold, a breath held, not lost. He told the story. Not just the science, the nights, the chalk. The first time he realized entropy could curve. He showed the video, not the simulation, but the boy's finger tracing condensation. A soft gasp moved through the crowd, not at the math, at the grace. Then he invited Emmett to the front. The boy didn't speak. He didn't need to. He walked to the board and drew. Not fast, not flashy, slow, precise, a spiral, then another, interlocking, breathing. Somewhere Layla began to cry. Grayson turned back to the audience. He never published a word, he said, but he reminded us what knowledge looks like before we name it. The crowd stood, not clapping, just standing, in stillness. A month later, the Institute renamed its simulation lab. The sign read, "The Emmett Room, for those who see differently." The plaque beneath said, "In recognition of insight beyond language, and the courage to let it speak." Back home, Jerry built a chalk wall in their living room. Every night, Emmett draws. Some spirals are new, some are old ones, folding again. And always, Jerry watches, not to understand, just to remember. That sometimes, the quietest truths are the ones that change everything. There are stories we forget, not because they weren't loud enough, but because they were quiet in the wrong places. Because they happened under fluorescent lights, past midnight, when the world had gone home and the janitor's son was still awake. Because they didn't begin with a name or end with applause, but with a spiral, drawn in dust. On a board nobody meant to leave behind. They say physics is the study of the universe's memory, of how light remembers where it's been, how gravity remembers mass, how time remembers direction. Maybe that's all Emmett ever did. He remembered something we forgot. That truth doesn't always speak. Sometimes it listens, sometimes it draws. And if we are quiet enough, if we are still, we might see the spiral again. On a window, on a wall, in a child's hand, still turning, still folding, still holding the universe together.